Michelle, thanks so much for joining us and for your work there. First off, can you tell us a bit about the story you wrote for Maclean's?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. The story that I wrote for Maclean's is about a faculty member at Emily Carr University, where I was an employee from 2018 until February of this year. Her name is Gina Adams, and she was hired in 2019 as part of an effort to increase Indigenous faculty representation at the university. And after she was hired, there were some questions raised about whether her Indigenous ancestry claims were truthful. And as an employee at the university, I kind of had a front row seat to how the situation was handled, and that's what I tried to explore in my piece for Maclean.
Yeah, like you mentioned, you were an employee. You write this with a view from inside the institution, a unique perspective for sure. What struck you the most about how the university handled the questions?
I think what struck me most is that there was no real process in place to address a question like this. So Emily Carr is not the only university that's tried to hire more Indigenous people in recent years. That's been a real effort, not just in academia, but in all kinds of sectors. And, you know, I think they're also not the only institution that's grappled with this kind of fallout from that decision. But I really realized while I was there that there was no process in place to address a question or a controversy like this. So, you know, I assume if a faculty member was hired on the basis of having a PhD in mathematics and someone claimed that they didn't really have that PhD, there'd be a process for contacting, you know, the university that granted their degree and asking for a transcript. There would be some kind of clear way to investigate and come to a conclusion. And in this case, it just seemed like there was no roadmap for the university to follow. And there was a real uncertainty about what to do. And I think that led to a kind of paralysis that's explored in the piece, because there was quite a long interval between the initial questions being raised and Gina Adams' resignation, which happened just a couple weeks ago.
Having dug into all of this, what were some ways that the university could have better responded to all of this?
You know, it's hard to say in hindsight, and I'm really sympathetic for the fact that universities and any institution dealing with this are in an incredibly difficult position because, like I say, there's no roadmap and nobody wants to put a foot wrong. And I really recognize that I think a lot of institutions and a lot of institutional leaders are concerned about, you know, furthering colonialism or racism by putting Indigenous people and their identities on trial. So I think it's really challenging. But one thing that I was really struck by is there were a lot of questions coming from Indigenous members of the community, and they were really fundamental questions to how Indigenous people situate our identities. So asking, you know, where are you from? Who are your family? Who claims you? Pretty basic introductory questions that weren't really given space to be asked publicly. There was no ability to talk about them within the institution. And I think, you know, if institutions want to indigenize, if they want to make their spaces safer for Indigenous people, if they want to have room for Indigenous knowledge and epistemologies, then they have to also accept Indigenous ways of doing things and give Indigenous communities a voice, particularly when those communities are being represented by faculty members who claim to be members.
I guess so. You know, how can institutions handle a lot of Indigenous people, their history is complex due to colonialism, the 60 Scoop just being one of those things. Is that a tough road for an institution to walk as well?
Yeah, absolutely it is. I mean, I think maybe the mistake that some institutions made was thinking that this would just be a simple process of hiring people and who say that they're Indigenous and letting their representation do a lot of the heavy lifting. You know, those histories are really complex. I think a lot of institutions maybe haven't grappled with what they're trying to do by increasing Indigenous representation, or who they're trying to represent. You know, is it about engaging with local host nations? Is it about increasing representation of Indigenous people who have been excluded from the academy, or who have faced racism for being visibly Indigenous? Is it about economic equity or educational equity? I mean, I think those are complicated questions, and it's hard to answer. And one of those questions is, you know, how important is it if somebody has lived experience of of being an Indigenous person? How important is it that they have a connection to the community they say they come from, or they have Indigenous knowledge to share? Is it just a question of ancestry and of ticking a box, or is there something deeper that they're looking for? And I think institutions have to grapple with those questions too.
Lots of questions, a big conversation to have. Michelle, we'll have to leave it there though, but appreciate you taking some time for us and again for the article.
Yeah, thank you so much.